I had a few comments, as I mentioned, about the content of some of the comments that you made in the assessment. I wanted to address those. Those of you who mentioned not enjoying the APA style, I wanted to bring you back to the final comments that I made in week 1, where I mentioned giving you opportunities to practice things before that knowledge is assessed. In the group project paper, I am going to expect to see at least one table and or figure. So the process of creating those, even if it didn't necessarily fit really well with that particular assignment, was to give you that experience of creating that table or that figure in kind of a low-cost environment where it's not going to result in a lot of points being taken off for a bigger assignment. So that would be the rationale behind the figure and table creation in those assignments. I also wanted to address some of the comments. As I mentioned, I did put the full comments on Scholar, so you can see there's a range of tone in those comments. These are anonymous, so I can't tell you who made which comments, but if you compare the comment on the left with the comment on the right, you can see that there is definitely a difference in tone there. And I mentioned being very responsive to student comments. I am much more likely to be responsive when they are worded more similarly to the left-hand side there. So keep that in mind as you are submitting comments, whether they're anonymous or not. Moving on to the rest of the week 6 activities. You did a great job in quiz 5. Again, there weren't any commonly missed questions. Online post 5, I was incredibly impressed. As I mentioned in the introduction, the study of gender is one of my absolute favorite topics in social psychology, so I really enjoyed reading your online posts. I put a quote here from one of you that I thought was especially good, and I also wanted to comment that a number of you had really good insights in the second half of that question, where you hypothesized certain patterns that you might see depending on each of those 3 different kind of conditions, and you gave some really good rationale and also thought through why you might not see differences in each of those conditions. So I'd like to applaud you for your thought process there. I thought it was very thoughtful, critical in a good way with the critical thinking skills. So pat yourselves on the back for that. And as I mentioned, I'll have feedback for the third reflective writing next week. So moving on to Module 14, which is the third module in Section 3, looking at social influence. This carries on some of the research that was done by Phil Zimbardo, as I mentioned. The overall question that unites all of these studies that we'll be talking about, all of this research, is how could people have committed the atrocities that led to the Nazi concentration camps between 1933 and 1945? So they were for a full 12 years. The last one was freed by Allied forces in 1945, April of 1945. And people were horrified to learn of the things that were happening in those camps. People were starved, literally worked to death. One of you mentioned that similar topics in the textbook were actually your least favorite, just because it was so disturbing to learn about the things that people would do, and it certainly is disturbing. So I can completely understand why it would be your least favorite. I would also say that it's one of the most important because it is so frightening, potentially. So it's definitely worth studying. As a side note, I, in high school, read the book Night by Elie Wiesel, and he actually came to speak at my high school when I was a student there. He was a survivor of the concentration camp, and he wrote a memoir of his experiences and reactions to his experiences. It's a relatively short book, and I would say it's worth a read. It's very well written, and it's not completely depressing, at least. So, as you might expect, social psychologists were very motivated to understand how and why people could behave in such a way against millions of innocent people, millions upon millions. They had some hypotheses about why the officers, administrators, and others participated in the process. And you can see there some of the potential explanations, or some of the potential answers. So those are the ones that we're going to be looking at. We already looked more about the last hypothesis, which Zimbardo tested in the Stanford prison experiment. This week, you'll learn about experiments testing conformity and obedience. And I posted a video link for each of those 2 additional studies on Scholar, so you'll be also watching those. So first, looking at conformity. Solomon Asch in the early 1950s wanted to know if people could behave that way because they're conforming to what they think others are thinking or wanting in the group. And as you're watching this video, I would encourage you to look at the 3 different conditions that were mentioned in the video and to look for potential reasons why the participants went along with the others or potentially didn't go along with the others. And the narrator mentions 2 types of conformity, so I'd encourage you to make sure you're looking for those 2 types of conformity. You can see the image on the right there represents sort of a summary of what the experience was like. So the participant would enter a room, would sit down, and then would be given these instructions that this was a perception task, and they were to match a line on the left with a set of lines on the right to identify which it actually corresponded with. The video goes into more detail, so I'll leave that to the narrator of that video. But it's a very interesting study, so I hope you enjoy that video. And the other component we'll be looking at is Milgram's studies on authority, or obeying. So this is another famous one, and again, I posted a link to this video on Scholar, so you can watch this too. The participant begins the experiment here superficially assigned to either a teacher or a learner condition, but in reality, all participants are assigned to a teacher condition, and this is under the guise of a learning experiment, so they want to know what facilitates learning. So they are seated in a room, and their accomplice or the confederate is seated in a separate room, and they're instructed to shock the confederate if the confederate gives the wrong answer. And you can see the board up there where it ranges from slight shock to intense shock, and then actually on the further right has XXX, which is 450 volts. And to put that in perspective, a standard electric outlet is 110 volts, which, as you can see, is somewhere between moderate and strong shock. And as you learned when you were a kid, you are definitely not supposed to put anything, especially anything metal, into an electric outlet because you can get seriously injured. If your body resistance is low, meaning if you're dry, if you're not grounded, then 100 could be like a tingling sensation. But if your body resistance is high, if you're sweaty or wet, and you are grounded, then it could actually result in cardiac arrest. This is why you are not supposed to curl your hair while you're in the bathtub, and you're not supposed to put a toaster in with you when you're in the bathtub, because not only are you wet, but you're also grounded and you could die. 220 volts is a large appliance like a dryer. So this went up to 450, which is very high. And I would like you to listen for the number of the percent of participants who administered all levels of shocks all the way up to 450 volts. Looking at the activities for this week. Again, I would suggest you look at the Week 6 activity feedback. Read through Module 14 and watch the 2 videos that look at the Asch studies and Milgram studies. Then complete Quiz 6 by Sunday at midnight and Online Post 6 by Sunday at midnight. And turn in the proposal outline for your group projects also by Sunday. And I would encourage you to email me with questions if anything isn't clear. If you need a little bit more guidance with a particular step, definitely let me know and I will get back to you as soon as I can. For a little bit more information about the proposal outline, I did present the rubric last week, so here it is again, and you can see that there are 10 points possible. Basically, each of these activities is worth 1 point. And again, develop this paper as much as you can. So the further that you can take it, the more fleshed out it is, the more paragraph form it's in, the better feedback I can give you, and the better your final project will be. There is an option to submit a paper draft, and especially if you're unsure about how you're supposed to approach one particular section, I would highly encourage you to submit that draft so that I can give you some great feedback and help you clarify things for the final paper. And as a reminder, I did post the APA style paper template, which is a docx file, so you can literally just plop content from your study in there and it'll automatically be correctly formatted. So to go through the different components here that make up the different 10 points in a little bit more detail, I would encourage you to think of an APA paper as being structured like an hourglass. So it's pretty broad or general at the top, And then it gets really specific, incredibly specific in the middle, and then it gets really broad again at the end. So you can see up at the top there, Jasmine is currently trapped in the sandy wasteland of her unfinished APA manuscript. So if you write your own awesome outline manuscript, then you can help free her from her prison. Most of the APA paper sections are pretty self-explanatory. That first line there, including all APA-style sections. The one that you may be relatively unfamiliar with is the expected results and discussion section. You'll write that section as if you have actual results, but they'll be worded tentatively. So that means if you were to say something like, if Group 1 demonstrates significantly higher self-esteem compared to Group 2, then we would conclude that manipulating hair color has a significant effect upon self-esteem. See Figure 2 for a visual representation of the difference between groups. So you're talking tentatively, so you're saying if this is higher than this group, then we would conclude this. As far as the logical progression of ideas, in the introduction section specifically, the first paragraph is very general. So this is the top of that hourglass. It introduces the topic, defines any important terms. It's very high level as far as specificity goes. The second and on paragraphs in the introduction section go through existing literature. So they get a little bit more specific. They're talking about what has already been done in research, potentially how. One important thing that I want to emphasize is to not include any numbers in the introduction section. So you're not going to include any statistics, any sample sizes, no means, no standard deviations, no regression coefficients, anything like that. Speak very generally. So the sample sentence that I gave, Group 1 demonstrates significantly higher self-esteem compared to Group 2, that would be appropriate. But you wouldn't want to say Group 1, who had a mean of 15.4, had higher self-esteem compared to Group 2, which had a mean of 10.8. So you wouldn't give any of those numbers. The only numbers that you'll include are those in citations, the year of publication. That's the only number that you'll have in the introduction section. The last paragraph for your introduction section will introduce your research question and your hypotheses, or hypothesis if you have one. The research question is, in a sense, where you logically end up after going through the existing literature. So this is what you think you're going to see. So it might be something pretty general like, manipulating hair color likely has a significant effect upon self-esteem. So that might be more of a general thing. If you're getting more specific with a hypothesis, then you would say changing someone's hair color from a more traditional hair color to a less traditional hair color will significantly increase their self-esteem. So you're going to specify which groups you're looking at, whether it's traditional or non-traditional hair color, and you're going to say what direction that effect is going to be. If you're not looking at a directional effect, then you would just be talking about the differences between groups. You want to make sure you say which group is higher than the other group and on what variable. So be as specific as you can with a hypothesis. It should be the testable statement. The method sections should be incredibly detailed. This is where you get into that tiny middle part of the hourglass. Provide the number of participants you plan to recruit, so your projected sample size, the breakdown of relevant demographics, so this could be age groups, gender, etc., and how you plan to recruit them, so what your recruitment strategy is. And then also include how you'll compensate them, whether you're going to pay them or compensate them with class credit, or maybe you're not going to compensate them, that's also an option. And then next, describe the research design. If you plan to do an experiment, specifically identify the independent variable and its levels, if it has levels. So let's say you're testing the effect of different amount of hot sauce on people's interest in socializing. Then you would describe the levels by giving the exact amounts of hot sauce that each group would consume. So Group 1 will consume 5 milligrams of hot sauce, and Group 2 will consume 25 milligrams of hot sauce. And then also explicitly identify the dependent variable or variables. So if you're looking at an interest in socializing, then you might have people walk into a room and count the number of people that they come up to interact with, or the distance between people measured in feet. So you want to have some kind of measurement also. It's very important. Unit of measurement they always talked about in science class, so it's the same in psychology. If your design is correlational, then just describe the variables and avoid any causal language, so using words like effects or causes. And I will wrap this up in one last bonus instructional video.